You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 255 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm going to be discussing two articles published in the Weekly Standard. Of course, this is a famed neoconservative publication that really focuses on basically the American empire doing all the worst things as it does and supporting it and propping it up and encouraging it. Of course, William Crystal, one of the founders of the publication, to just tell you where it is ideologically. And on today's show, I do want to go through these two articles that I think really highlight what's wrong with U.S. policy in Syria and Iran and debunk them. Just another quick note before we get into the content of today's show. There was not going to be an episode of Foreign Policy Focus on Monday the 8th, and the next show will be on Wednesday the 10th. Typically, I do 3 shows a week, every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. It's very rare that I miss an episode. I think this is the first one this year, so hopefully you guys could find your foreign policy news either, with any of the great other foreign policy, podcasts that I discuss on this show, but also, just by checking up on the Libertarian Institute. The website is libertarianinstitute.org, and there you can find my daily news roundup. You can find my podcast there on the homepage. There's also great other, libertarian and foreign policy content. Scott Horton is the man behind that site, as well as Jared LaBelle and Sheldon Richmond. So, I can't recommend that you go there enough, not only for my content, to share my content, but, to access other great libertarian content. All right, now on to the first article. This one was published October 1st, and it's, both of these articles are written by the editorial board of the Weekly Standard. This one is titled Return of the Bush Doctrine, and it's, phrased in a question. Just for a definition, what the Bush Doctrine is, described in the words of George Bush himself, is to regard nations that support or harbor terrorism are to be regarded as hostile nations to the United States. So, the important part here is that, the Bush Doctrine kind of says that anywhere there's support for terrorism, it's like they're actively at war against the United States. And so then we should go take military action there. The height of the Bush Doctrine, I think, the support was drummed up for the invasion in Iraq in 2003. And, a lot of the point to that invasion was because Saddam Hussein was working with the terrorists and had worked with the terrorists and could potentially give a terrorist a weapon of mass destruction, whether that be a biological, a chemical, or a nuclear weapon, and use that against the United States or our allies. One thing I want to stop to point out here is that the editors of the Weekly Standard describe this policy as the assertion of great moral clarity, and that essentially this is the right thing morally for the Americans to do. And so, I think from there you could kind of see where the minds of these men are. That they say, the right moral thing to do is carry out all these operations that slaughter all these civilians. I mean, most Americans at this point, I don't think believe the Iraq war was a good idea. I mean, there may be some people who kind of are like, well, yeah, maybe we had to do that still. The Rush Limbaugh types, but I think even most right-leaning Americans now say, the world would be a better place had we not taken out Saddam Hussein. Finding a place where the Bush Doctrine was actually carried out is pretty hard to do, other than maybe Afghanistan, where the Taliban regime did have this policy where they supported Muslim rebellions anywhere, particularly Kashmir. I think, they were more concerned about than the Arab Muslims. But this allowed them, by the Taliban code, to then allow, Osama bin Laden to live in Afghanistan. And although there are some examples from under the Clinton years where it did seem that the Taliban leadership would have allowed the United States to take out Osama bin Laden, really up into when the United States invaded Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden, or I guess up until 9/11 is kind of when Osama bin Laden was still receiving that, kind of tribal code protection from the Taliban. But other than that, if you look at what actually has happened in Iraq or Somalia or Yemen or Libya or Syria, in the Obama years, we really haven't done all that much to take on the states that, quote unquote, sponsor terrorism. In fact, if you look at the Middle East and where a lot of the money comes from to the terrorists, and this isn't to say that every Saudi, Emirati, or Qatari is a sponsor of terrorism, but there are very wealthy people within the leadership of those countries. And let's remember that these are mostly monarchies. And so the, people who live in those countries don't have a whole lot to say. And I'm definitely not advocating for the United States to carry out the Bush Doctrine and invade Saudi Arabia. However, these are the countries that, drive a lot of the funding for the terrorist groups. And I mean, if we look at 9/11 and then include Egypt, this is, where most of the terrorists, the hijackers came from. I think any right-minded American who, when explained what the Bush Doctrine is and kind of how this was the foreign policy under George W. Bush, they would either, I think, reject the doctrine or at least reject the idea that America has followed it. And so it's really interesting that you have the leadership from this very prominent news source, just going right out and saying that, this would, the article is about how this would be a great thing, a return to the Bush Doctrine. Now in the next paragraph, you almost think that they're going to say something right. Basically say that, George Bush didn't completely follow the Bush Doctrine, and this is true, but that Obama completely abandoned it. And now you would expect the next sentence to say, by fighting a war against the Houthis in Yemen and by overthrowing Gaddafi in favor of the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which turns out to be in large portion Al-Qaeda, and then in Syria with the support for the rebellion that eventually, created in the, reports of the own U.S. government. A 2012 DIA memo said that, this was likely to be caused by the United States support for the Syrian resistance. We, end up with an Islamic State, and even John Kerry later admits when he's Secretary of State that, the United States thought they could manage the uprising of the Islamic State. And so, these policies were no accident by Obama, that, all these terrible things happened and largely helped the radical Sunni jihadists who are, the enemies, the avowed enemies of the American people. And, really at the, expense of stability in the Middle East. I mean, Libya is still a failed state. It's absolutely terrible what's going on there. Yemen is still in the middle of an absolutely bloody war. And the war in Syria looks like it's finally slowing down a little bit. However, you still have what even the U.S. envoy to Syria admitted is the world's largest terrorist safe haven in the Idlib province of Syria. The area is still held by the Syrian rebels. So, in these ways, I think you could really say that the Obama did reject the Bush Doctrine in favor of a responsibility to protect or humanitarian interventionist foreign policy that really had outcomes of producing absolutely horrific humanitarian situations and empowering the very jihadist groups that, are the enemies of the United States. However, the Weekly Standard article, almost jaw-dropping, says that the one thing that the Obama administration did wrong that highlights the entire problem of the Obama foreign policy is the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the Iran nuclear agreement. It's really unbelievable that they cite this. Now they say that, we thought all along Iran was cheating on the deal, and they cite some cases where Iran had, I think, either nearing or slightly over the limit of heavy water. However, soon after Iran got that amount of heavy water, they were holding way down. And so it's not like they were trying to pull the cloak over at anyone's eyes on it. I think it was just a matter of, the heavy water was produced before the ship arrived. And so there's no real violations of the Iranian nuclear deal by Iran. However, even before Trump actually left the whole deal, he was already threatening to put sanctions back on Iran and not really encouraging American business with Iran, which was, America's part of the agreement. Now, this article doesn't seem to focus on that issue, and I think it's because they even have to admit to some extent that it's wrong. There's no evidence that Iran was actually in violation of the JCPOA, and they really don't even argue that the JCPOA achieved its goals of preventing Iran from getting nuclear weapons. Now, several times in this article and the next article I'll discuss, they kind of, implicitly say Iran is getting nuclear weapons, but they never explain how, and that's because they can't. So you don't have the argument that, this nuclear deal wasn't good enough and Iran was going to secretly get nuclear weapons. No, the Iran nuclear deal did exactly its purpose. It prevented Iran from getting a nuclear weapon and really safeguarded and restricted their civilian energy program. But you don't find those concessions in this piece, and only, there are problems with the deal, which also included that it didn't do enough. It says that basically, the United States negotiated a nuclear agreement with Iran. It doesn't say that, the agreement was working, but it does say that the problem with the deal is that it didn't cover enough, which is absolutely silly. The United States continued to sanction Iran even once the deal was in place, and there was plenty of sanctions on Iran after, Obama lifted the sanctions that were agreed to be lifted by this agreement. So the argument is really we just need more sanctions on Iran. The sanctions are still in place, but, they say, this didn't stop Iran's missile program, which Iran may not be willing to give up. As much as the rhetoric coming from Iran is very hostile towards their neighbors, specifically Israel and Saudi Arabia, this is something that goes both ways. And, the UAE and Saudi Arabia and the United States and even Israel routinely talk about regime change in Iran. And, the United States is very high-ranking members of the Trump administration, including John Bolton and Rudy Giuliani, are very much supporters of the Iranian separatist group, the MEK, and have even suggested that the MEK could be the ruling party of Iran during the Trump administration. So the threats really go both ways on this one. I don't think it's really right to point the finger either way. And that means that Iran is going to need a weapon to defend themselves and a deterrent from people attacking them. And I think Iran has identified their missile program as this weapon. They also complain that Iran supports terrorists abroad and harbors Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups. These claims have been made for years. They've always been debunked. It's kind of like the claims that Saddam Hussein harbored terrorists. And, it's really not true. I think even after 9/11, Iran offered to give some of the Al-Qaeda terrorists that they were holding to the United States. However, this request was refused by the U.S. And so what they would like to see, I guess, is an agreement, or this is what they say they would like to see, that Iran withdraws all their troops from anywhere outside of Iran and doesn't support any groups outside of Iranian borders, and for Iran to completely and verifiably dismantle their missile program. I don't think either of those second two requirements are asks of the Iranians are really realistic to anything that Iran would be willing to give up. We did see Iran was willing to give up their nuclear program and did. Now, could we have negotiated caps on Iran's missiles or, limit their funding to groups that we really don't like? We allow them to continue to support Hezbollah, but we try to curb their support for Hamas or something like that. Those are certainly foreign policy objectives that the United States could have continued to have even after the JCPOA was passed. This is really summed up and, pointed out in the Weekly Standard article by Trump's UN speech where he says, Iran's leaders continue to sow chaos, death, and destruction in the Middle East. And, to some extent, this is true. There's certainly actions taken by either Iranian-backed militia, specifically in Iraq. There's a lot of evidence that, they were involved in some torture after they liberated cities from ISIS, as well as maybe some issues. And there's a lot of allegations of, population and kind of ethnic cleansing charges where they just, basically kick all the Sunnis out of an area. And so there are some bad things that, Iran has done in the Middle East. But of course you have to look and see that the United States is the worst actor, the largest actor, at least in the Middle East, where we have supported, numerous groups, they're very dangerous, over the course of the past 20 years or so. The next charge is probably the most laughable, and that is that Iran doesn't respect their neighbor's sovereignty. My guess is that there's some Iranian-backed forces in Iran that are there, that are probably unwanted by the local population, of like the various region or area of Iraq, but largely I think the Iranian troops are Iranian-backed forces are welcomed within Iraq, and especially by a large chunk of the Shiite population, and are probably, it would be interesting to see some polling on this, but possibly are even more popular than the American forces that remain in Iraq. When you move over the border to Syria, it becomes even more clear that America is the one to guess and Iranian is the invited ally. This is repeatedly, from the leadership of Syria. And as much as Assad may not be the greatest person in the world, he is the leader and sits on the throne in Damascus. And he says that the Iranians are an invited ally and that the American troops have no right being there. And so if somebody's not respecting the sovereignty of the states in the Middle East, it's very much the United States more so than Iran. Trump has continued to repeat this line that I find interesting just because Trump uses it so much, and that's why I'm pointing it out, that basically the Iranian leadership are plundering the wealth of the Iranian people, and that this is some great crime in Iran that apparently occurs nowhere else, maybe than, Russia, China, and North Korea. However, if you look all over the Middle East, everywhere the leadership is rich and everybody else is absolutely dirt poor. And so this really isn't a unique condition to the to Iran. And even then to the United States. Look how wealthy the political class is versus the rest of most of America. Now there is here a complaint about the cash. You always hear, Donald Trump saying the cash. And here we have in the Weekly Standard as well saying that, Obama gave this cash to Iran through the nuclear deal. And look at all the horrific things they used it on. I'm sure not all that money went to good purposes, and I'm not naive about, all the things the Iranian state, specifically the actions of the IRGC. However, it wasn't that much money versus the amount of money that other states and actors in the Middle East dump in every day. And so, the kind of point here is that the Weekly Standard makes Iran out to be a unique and dangerous boogeyman in the Middle East when really, it's just not the case. It's interesting that the Nets, and they probably don't see the irony in this, that they move on to the sanctions. And of course, if you're complaining about policies that make the Iranian leadership rich, or at least more well off than the rest of the Iranian people, look no further than sanctions, because that's, exactly the result of sanctions in every single situation. Every time the United States pretends that we're going to sanction a country and then the people are going to rise up and overthrow the leadership. And this never ever happens. What actually ends up happening is that the people suffer, the people get poor, and at times are even less likely to overthrow the regime. And then, with the outside pressure, war is the health of the state. If another country is aggressing upon you and preventing you from getting the supplies and the medicine that your family needs, well, you're going to see them as your enemy, not your government. The authors of this article do note that Europe is really undermining these sanctions. And I think I'm surprised this isn't a bigger deal to them, because if the United States sanctions start to be undermined, then the United States doesn't have a whole lot of leverage to use against Iran outside of military leverage. And now that I'm saying that, maybe that's exactly why the authors of this article don't make a bigger deal about this, because they don't really care about diplomacy and want military action against Iran. Next, the editors of the Weekly Standard say that Iran supported terrorism in the United States and Europe, and points to a few small examples. I haven't seen evidence that Iran has actually, been behind any terror attacks in the United States or Europe. Certainly not since 9/11. I'm not sure. There's the argument for the Khobar Towers, which I lean more towards being Al-Qaeda and not Iran. And then the Barrett's bombings in Beirut, which is blamed on, the group that eventually becomes Hezbollah, and then the Iranian support they were getting. But certainly, if you look at since 9/11, almost all the terrorist attacks have been done by Sunni jihadists, which of course are not the core of the Iranian Shiite state. And, that's not necessarily to say that it's because there's something within Sunni Islam that makes you blow people up versus Iranian Shiite Islam. However, the United States has been killing an awful lot more Sunnis than they have Shia, I think, in their time through the Middle East. The article kind of rounds out by complaining about the Iranian support for three groups around the Middle East. That's Hezbollah, Hamas, and Assad. In the next article, we'll really talk about the Assad piece, so I'll kind of leave that one off for now. As far as it goes, they say that, Lebanese Hezbollah is supported by Iran by $700 million a year. Of course, if we look at, the other side of the would-be conflict with Hezbollah, which is, of course, Israel, the United States gives them the support of $5 or $6 billion a year. And so, again, if you look at who the bigger actor here is, it's clearly not Iran and Lebanon. It's the, Israeli state with a very advanced and powerful military. All right, that's about it, other than for some ranting about how, the Obama policy, the problem with it is Obama was naive and he really thought he could get this deal done with the Iranians, but it turns out that they're just awful people who are going to lie and cheat and do terrible things throughout the world. That's because that's what, Iranians, religious leadership is going to do. I think that's a pretty ridiculous charge, but there you have it. The next article that is actually quite a bit shorter, and that's titled Trump Rethinks Syria, published October 3rd. The article starts out, and I think the first paragraph is accurate, saying that Trump wanted to leave Syria, that this was his first instinct. We heard it throughout his campaign, that we are going to knock the hell out of ISIS, but then we are coming home. Turns out he was convinced by his advisors to do otherwise. And this was the saddest part to me about the Trump administration, is that he had what seemed to be decent instincts about, what should happen in specifically Syria and Afghanistan. And then because he had no real principles that he was standing on and probably really didn't mean or care about the things he was saying anyways, was taught out of them by his advisors. And, now we're in a situation where we're really doubling down in Syria. So the authors of the Weekly Standard say the new mission in Syria is Iran. And this is, I think in their view, that they want Iran to completely leave Syria. The claims in the next paragraph are almost unbelievable. They say the nightmare in Syria has been caused by Iran. Now, even if you accept the narrative laid out by the Weekly Standard, which is Assad is responsible for every terrible thing that's happened in Syria, which I think is a straw man and really unfair even, for Assad, who's certainly not a great person. However, the United States and Turkey, Qatar, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Israel all supported these jihadist groups who were doing terrible things in Syria and who were no better than Assad. And, the Syrian people probably have a preference for Assad over these Sunni radical groups like the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, even some of the groups that aren't necessarily labeled as Al-Qaeda like Dinor al-Zinki, which beheaded a young Palestinian boy. However, say you do accept that Assad is responsible for everything. I don't know how Iran is more responsible to blame than Assad. And if you're going to go with the argument, well, Assad would have fallen without the support of Iran, really Assad would have fallen without the support of Vladimir Putin in Russia. And so Russia was the far bigger player there. And I'm sure on a different day of the week when they were writing an article about how big of a threat that Russia is to the United States, then maybe they would have identified the Putin as the key butcher in Syria. However, pointing out Iran is a laughable charge. I think another pretty laughable charge that is made here is that the mullahs of Iran are on a quest to dominate the entire Middle East. I see Iran's actions, specifically in Syria and in Iraq, as being more part of their own national defense interests. You really don't want the country next door to be the Islamic State, especially if the Islamic State fanatics see your country and your government as an enemy. And we can see, the gains made by Iran, specifically, in Iraq and their influence there really occurred all after the 2003 invasion by the U.S. of Iraq, which, created this vacuum that Iran was able to step up and, gain a lot more support. And, now the Iraqi state is an allied state of Iran. The same thing in Syria, where the destabilization caused by the policies of the United States and our allies leads to a situation where Assad needs to call on and be dependent on his allies for help. This allows Iran and their, allied forces of, Shia militias and Hezbollah to come to the aid of Assad. However, I don't know if that aid really would have turned the tides of the war had Russia not gotten involved anyways. I want to read the next paragraph of the article to you, just because it's pretty outrageous, and I think you'll see pretty quickly. The mullahs are bent on dominating the region and building a land bridge that stretches from Tehran to Beirut. Such a bridge would give them closer proximity to Israel and make it easier to strike the so-called Little Satan with nuclear weapons Iran supposedly wouldn't dream of building. So there's an awful lot, that comes with that statement. First of all, Iran, by signing the nuclear agreement, which, I discussed in about the previous article, they even, kind of concede, what was working effectively, that Iran is willing to give up their nuclear ambition. So we could throw that away right away. The idea of Iran building a land bridge from Tehran to Beirut. Well, what is a land bridge? A road. So, if it would sound absolutely ridiculous if they said it just factually that Iran is looking to build a road from Tehran to Beirut, because obviously the road from Tehran to Beirut was opened up by the 2003 invasion of Iraq, when the United States helped overthrow the hostile regime of Saddam Hussein and allowed for free and fair elections, which of course elected a government much more favorable to the Shia government in Iran. And the idea that this moves Iran closer to Israel, if you look, what moved Iran closer to Israel, if anything, is the fact that Israel invaded and occupied Lebanon, and, the people of southern Lebanon were dependent on an outside force to help come in and remove the occupying force. And then, of course, by the United States' actions in Syria, as I've discussed before, this has led to increasing Iranian influence in Syria. However, even then, Iran has been in compliance with agreements made between Russia and Israel regarding the placement of Iranian troops in Syria, being, I think, about 60 kilometers away from the border, or actually, I believe the border of the Golan Heights, not even the border with Israel. And so the idea that this is moving Iran closer to Israel, the Iranian actions alone, and this is, the mullah's idea of dominating the Middle East is really ridiculous, and it just shows the absolute hysteria and fear-mongering of these people. U.S. official James Jeffrey recently put out some statements on the current U.S. goals in Syria. The first is to defeat ISIS. The second is to return to the political process. So this is the Assad must go position, I think is the way it ultimately works out from the perspective of the U.S. And the third is the removal of all Iranian commanded forces from Syria. I'm guessing this would be by the U.S. definition of Iranian commanded forces, and could include any Shia militias and then Hezbollah from Syria, which may not be logistically possible for the Syrian government at this point. The Syrian government may feel that the removal of these troops, and could be the practical situation, that the removal of these troops actually ends up allowing ISIS or another, Al-Qaeda linked group to, come back and take some territory in Syria. The Syrian civil war is not yet over, although Assani, who, is a Syrian commentator, recently appeared on both Moderate Rebels and the Around the Empire podcast and explained that Iranian influence in Syria is dwindling, not necessarily because of a result of the U.S. policy or anything like that, but just as the Syrian resistance to Assad is defeated, they are less needed. Now, Bolton's policy is that the United States troops, Bolton is of course the national security advisor to the president, is that these troops will remain in Syria as long as there are any Iranian troops outside of Iran. I've discussed this on previous episodes, so I'm not going to get into it too much right now. However, another ridiculous demand. The United States is in 130 something countries, I believe, with our armed forces. So that us saying that we can't have Iranian forces in Iran's neighborhood in countries where they're asked to be there is, an unreasonable demand, and actually, goes against the sovereignty of Iran and all these other countries, something Donald Trump claims to support. Secretary of Defense James Mattis has, the most reasonable position that he's put out, which is basically that legally all the United States is there to do is fight ISIS. And that is an issue that, this article doesn't address, the Trump administration doesn't address, and nobody in the mainstream media is asking because they're all, kind of talking about the Supreme Court justice hearings, that is the United States have a legal right to be in Syria to fight Iran? Does, the U.S. government have the authority from, its own people to wage that war? The answers to those questions are obviously no, but if nobody asks, they're pretty meaningless. The authors of this article conclude with a sentence, the right course to stay in Syria, or the right course for Syria, stay. And so, I think pretty much everything that I've mentioned in this episode here tells us why, it's ridiculous for the United States to stay in Syria. The best course of action is for us to leave. Again, going back to those interviews of Asani, I find it very interesting that he mentions, I guess, that the Assad government is kind of willing to wait out the United States, knowing that eventually they're going to leave. The problem for the United States is that these are kind of low budget, low risk wars. The U.S. troops stay there, and there's not a real insurgency, at least right now, targeting the U.S. troops. And, it's by the standards of the United States budget, not a reasonable person, a relatively cheap operation. All right, that about wraps it up for my debunking these two Weekly Standard articles. I hope everybody enjoyed this show. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com and libertarianinstitute.org. If you really like the show and want to support it, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus, Twitter at KYAAALE, Facebook, Libertarian Union. And again, just to remind everyone, no show on Monday. I will be back Wednesday, October 10th with a new episode. Have a good weekend.